The church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, which I visited a week or so ago, is particularly notable for two things. For some, the main focus of interest is a reliquary in which are displayed some links of chain, supposedly the chains which bound St. Peter when he was in prison. But to others, and I confess this is why I particularly wanted to go to the church, the main reason to visit is to see a tomb. It's the tomb of a pope, but to be honest, the tombs of popes are 10 a penny in Rome. But this one is special because it contains as its central figure a statue of Moses by Michelangelo. The tomb fills the equivalent of the south transept of the church. And in the middle of it, Moses sits more than life-sized, tablets of stone under his well-muscled right arm, the tendrils of his flowing beard reaching his waist, his legs placed, looking as if he might at any moment rise to his feet, his face turned to look in perpetuity down the nave of the church, the expression on his face one of frowning intensity. Michelangelo himself apparently considered this to be his masterpiece, and when you think of all the other things he did, that's quite a claim. Only extraordinary artistry can make stone look so lifelike. Coming from seeing that tomb to reading the text for this morning, it struck me quite forcibly that Moses is at the center of both. But the image of the greatest prophet adorns the tomb of a pope few could tell you much about, while he himself lies, according to Exodus, in an unmarked grave, the location of which was very quickly forgotten. There's a deep poignancy about that. The story from Exodus, which Thelma read for us a minute or two ago, is, I find, rather a sad story. It brings to an end one of the greatest stories of all time, the story that we have been following all this season since Pentecost. As we have seen, it's a story of hardship and success, of times of suffering and times of plenty, of promises broken and promises kept, of closeness to God and at times distance from God. It's a story of sin and virtue, of faithfulness and faithlessness, of terrible sorrows and deepest joys, of dangers and divine protection. It is in every sense an epic tale, a tale involving tremendous journeys, a tale spanning many generations. And while no story ever really has a beginning, because there's always something which has happened before, and no story ever really has an end, because something always happens after, the story which began with God singling out a man who would otherwise have been long forgotten, changing his name from Abram to Abraham, and making him a promise that his descendants would form a great nation, and that a long, long time in the future, those descendants of a man who lived as a nomad would at last have a land to call their own. It is a powerful story. And it's powerful because it takes many of the contradictions which life throws up, and it combines them in a way which helps those who listen to it make sense of them. It's a powerful story because it's a story which talks about identity. The identity as a nation of the Israelites, and their identity as a people whose faith is in the God they called Yahweh, the God whom we simply call God, in the conviction that there is no other. It is a story which says, this is who we are. This is why we are. This is how we came to be. This is why we are where we are. But as I have emphasized consistently, this is not history. It's something deeper. Its component parts are not verifiable facts learned from contemporary documentation or found in the archaeological record. This story is made from myths and legends, conveyors of truth. Individual stories told and retold until they become part of the teller's and the listener's very being. Told as ways of expressing big questions. Who are we? Who is God? What is our relationship with God? It's also a powerful story because of what it means even today. It's a story about promise and possession. Today in our reading, we have reached the point at which the promised land is within sight. The years of wandering in the wilderness are nearly over. The next stage, possession of the land, settling upon it, is about to begin. But the story as told in Exodus misses a crucial point. When God showed Moses all the land spread out before Mount Nebo, God did not show Moses a land which was unoccupied. There were people living there already. Yet the Israelites believed it had been promised to them. And here in this text is a reminder of the root of the trouble which persists to this day. The book of Exodus, because it is the religious text of one people, omits to mention the conflict and the driving out of the existing residents of the land, the people who already lived there and regarded it as home. Now, we are reading this text just a few days short of the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, which on the 2nd of November 1917 set out the British government's support for the creation of what it called a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. I'd always imagined that the Balfour Declaration would be a long and detailed document, but it's not. It reads, "His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And this was in a letter sent from the Foreign Secretary to an organisation in London which was advocating for the creation of a national homeland for the Jews. And part of the reason why this is such a historically important document is that it was the first indication from a then major world power of support for moves which would lead eventually to the creation of the modern state of Israel, which came into being in 1948, and which, as we know, has led to continual struggle and conflict over possession of the land. This is not the time. We certainly do not have time nor space in this service to debate or rehearse the rights and wrongs of either the Balfour Declaration or the actions of the State of Israel or of the Palestinian people. But it may be the time to raise some questions. Can people really possess land? Does God give land to some and take it from others? What does ownership of anything really mean? And how, if we were somehow to revise our ideas of ownership, might our relations with other people change? Now, these are very big questions indeed. But they are questions which, more and more, as populations expand and resources are consumed quicker, we need to be asking. But while this story at least prompts these questions in my mind, I have to admit that it does not in itself raise them. The story from Exodus leads us in different directions, and it leaves unanswered a really important question which it does pose. And that's this: why, when Moses was the one who led the people out of slavery and through the years in the wilderness, receiving the basics of the law on the way and organizing these wretched former slaves into a self-conscious nation and laying the foundations for the practice of their faith, was he not able finally to lead them into the promised land? His death on the eve of their taking possession, no matter how problematic that was, somehow seems to offend our sense of fairness. Why couldn't he just have been allowed to see it through? Remember what I said about no story really having a beginning or an end. Moses' birth was not the beginning of this story, nor was his death the end of it. The story is still unfolding thousands of years later and will do till the end of time. Moses' death, before the entry of the people into the promised land, tells us a number of things. It tells us something about the nature of religious leadership, that it is service of others rather than fulfillment of the personal which matters. It tells us something about the fact that the individual is less important than the community, and that the community will go on even without a key individual. And remember what I've been saying about this story as a whole, that it is an allegory for the whole of life. Here again we are reminded of that. Moses was not the only one who had died on the journey to the promised land. The one to whom the promise had first been made, Abraham and Sarah, they hadn't seen the promised land. Neither had Isaac or Rebekah or Jacob and Rachel, to name but a few of the many thousands who never even saw the land which the Israelites were to possess. Even many who had left Egypt died in the wilderness. Some were born there, may have died there too. Their whole lives lived in this between time and place. Yet each one, along with Moses, contributed to the great effort to reach the place of promise. This makes me think of the church, and it gives me hope. Few, I think, would dispute the view that the church is in some wilderness years. At least across Europe and North America, the number of professing Christians is in decline. Congregations are getting smaller and poorer and less able to do what they would like. Churches are closing. Many of us are making as much effort as we can, but we've been doing it for a long time, and it's very tiring. Many of us are making as much effort as we can, but we're not seeing results. Perhaps we're not sure where to go, what to do next. We're not yet able to see the promised land. Yet we can be sure of this: there is a promised land. Wilderness is not endless, nor is the time in it without limit. You and I may, like Moses, never make it to where God is leading his Son's church. But each of us is contributing to the journey. That is the role of the faithful in every generation. Many, as we know, fall away. Many give up, but not all. And we who do not fall away, we who do not give up, have the consolation and the joy of knowing that we are doing God's work. That sometime, in God's time, if not our time, all that work over countless generations will come to fruition, and Christ's church will flourish. Amen. Thanks be to God.